A clause is part of a sentence. So the sentence, I went to the restaurant and ordered steak and chips, has two clauses, separated by the word and. Relative clauses are clauses which tell us who, which, where, or when something happened. The man who hit me was Jason's brother. Who hit me is the relative clause in this sentence, as who tells us which man we're talking about. The Coven is that club I've been telling you about. Here, I've been telling you about is the relative clause which identifies which club we are talking about. Here, the pronoun that has been left out. We use the relative adverb whose, which is not the same as whose with an apostrophe, when we want to talk about something which belongs to someone. We usually use whose to talk about a person, but it can also be used to talk about things. The man whose dog was barking all night is deaf, so he can't hear a thing. The country, whose economy is weak at the moment, is proving very popular for holidaymakers. The relative pronouns who, that, or which are most commonly used in relative clauses. We use who when we are talking about people, and which when we are talking about things. That can be used for both people and things. When talking about people, it is less common than who, and when talking about things is more common than which, and also less formal. The woman that sold me the house is now living in South America. There aren't any animals which are dangerous to humans in Britain.
Defining relative clauses identify a noun more clearly. They make it clear which person or thing we are talking about. So, for example, if we look at this photograph, I can say, the man is my brother. But there is a problem with this sentence, because this sentence is not clear, because there are two men in the photograph. So there's a man here and a man here. So which man is my brother? We do not know. So we use a defining relative clause. The man who is standing is my brother. So the three words who is standing, this is the defining relative clause. And it defines the noun man. So it is identifying the man more clearly. It is making it very clear that it is the man who is standing, the man on the right, who is my brother. Okay? So this is the defining relative clause. And relative clauses, they are good because they allow us to write complex sentences. So complex sentences are longer sentences which have a dependent and an independent clause. And they are a much better style of English than simply short, simple sentences. Okay? And we link the relative clause to the noun with a relative pronoun. So this is the relative pronoun in this sentence. It is the word who. And it is a relative pronoun because it represents the noun man. Okay? So it takes the place of the noun man, and that links it to the whole of the relative clause. Who is standing? And we will look at all of these relative pronouns in detail. So the relative pronoun who we use it for people, and it can be the subject or the object pronoun. Example: the customer who called me was happy. So who called me is the relative clause, and who is the relative pronoun. And it is the subject. Sorry, who in this sentence is the subject pronoun, because who is representing the customer, and the customer called me, so it is the subject. The customer who I called was angry. Again, this is the relative pronoun who, but this time it is the object pronoun, because I called the customer, so it is the object. Whom. Again, this is for people, but it is only used as an object pronoun. So this time we say the customer whom I called was angry. And this is the object pronoun. I called the customer, and whom is representing the customer. It's the object. So whom is only the object pronoun. But be careful, whom is only really used in very formal English. Okay, it's very formal. In spoken English, in a very formal context, and sometimes in written English. But it is much more common to use who as the object pronoun for people. So this is more common. And who and whom are often replaced by that in spoken English. And I will explain that in a few minutes. Which. This is for things or animals. And it can be used as the subject or object pronoun. Example: it's a book which will interest you. Which will interest you. So which will interest you is the relative clause, and which is the relative pronoun. And it is the subject in this example, because which is representing book, and the book will interest you. So book and which, they are the subject. And here is an example with which as the object pronoun. The car which he bought was expensive. So he bought a car, and the car was expensive. So it is the object. And again, the word which is often replaced by that in spoken English. So let's look at that. So we can use it for people or things. And it can also be the subject or the object pronoun. Example: the customer that called me was angry. And this is the subject pronoun. So we have a choice. We can either say the customer who called me was angry, or the customer that called me was angry. And here we have the word that as an object pronoun referring to a person, the customer. The customer that I called was happy, so I called the customer. it's a film that scared us. So here, that is referring to a thing, film, and it is being used as a subject pronoun. The film scared us. The dress that she was wearing was beautiful. So that, this time, is an object pronoun. She was wearing a dress, and it was beautiful. So that is the object. So that is very, very common in spoken English. You will hear it a lot instead of who or which. Okay? Whose. It is for people or things. And it is a possessive pronoun. It's a possessive. Example, I know a man whose daughter lives in New York. So whose, it is a possessive. And this sentence actually means that it is the man's daughter that lives in New York. Okay, the man's daughter lives in New York. So it is the daughter of the man who lives in New York. Okay, so it's the daughter. It's not the man who lives in New York. Jane works in a restaurant whose manager is never there. So this means that, well, the restaurant, there is a manager of the restaurant, and the manager is never there. So it is the restaurant's manager is never there, or the manager of the restaurant is never there. So it's a possessive. The position of prepositions is very important. And there are two choices for the position of prepositions. One, before the relative pronoun. But this is very, very formal. And the second choice is at the end of the relative clause. And this is more informal and more common in everyday English. So let's look at both choices. I like the people with whom I work. So that is very formal. We have the preposition with before the relative pronoun whom, with whom I work. But much more common, much more informal, we say, I like the people that I work with. That I work with. So here the preposition is at the end of the relative clause. That is the flat in which my parents live. In which, so the preposition in is before the relative pronoun which. Remember, that is formal. And the informal way is that is the flat which my parents live in. So the preposition in is now at the end of the sentence, and the relative pronoun is at the beginning of the clause. However, be careful. For choice number one, there is an exception for choice number one, and who or that are not used after prepositions. So, for example, we cannot say, I like the people with who I work. That is wrong. And we cannot say, that is the flat in that my parents live. Okay? So, that is wrong, but that is correct. Well, all of these are correct. Okay? Another rule is that the relative pronoun can be omitted when it is the object of the clause. Omitted, this means that we can miss it out. We can not put it there. So it is only when it is the object. So here is an example with the relative pronoun. The customer who I called was very happy. So that is correct. But we can omit, if we want to, we can omit the relative pronoun. So we can simply say, the customer I called was very happy. And that is also correct. So the meaning of both of these sentences is the same. We have just omitted the word who. He is eating the sandwich that you made. And if we omit the relative pronoun, we say, he is eating the sandwich you made. Okay? Notice that in both of these examples, the relative pronoun is the object of the clause. I called the customer. You made the sandwich. Okay, it's the object. But be careful. When the relative pronoun is the subject of the clause, it cannot be omitted. So it is compulsory. The relative pronoun is compulsory if it is the subject of the clause. Example, the customer who called me was angry. But we cannot say, the customer called me yesterday was angry. That would be wrong. Okay? We must keep the relative pronoun when it is the subject. Punctuation, this is the last rule. Punctuation rule. We do not use commas when writing defining relative clauses. For example, here we have the sentence without commas. And this is correct. It's a book which will interest you. And here it is with a comma. This is the comma here in red. It's a book which will interest you. Okay, so that is wrong. It's a common mistake, so that is why I'm explaining it. The girl who is talking to Mark is my sister. And so that is correct. But with a comma, with two commas, it is wrong. Okay? So we do not use commas when writing defining relative clauses. However, we only use commas when writing non-defining relative clauses. So this is a different type of relative clause, and I will explain this type of relative clause in a different video. Okay? But just understand that for defining relative clauses, everything I explained in this video, you do not use commas. So, non-defining relative clauses give us more information about a noun. Non-defining relative clauses do not define or identify the noun. And non-defining relative clauses are common in written English. Okay? So they are more common in written English. Example. We visited Hyde Park, which is close to Buckingham Palace. So this is the non-defining relative clause. So it's after the comma, and it is which is close to Buckingham Palace. And so the non-defining relative clause gives us more information about Hyde Park. So this is the noun, Hyde Park. It is a famous park in London. And so the non-defining relative clause simply gives us more information about the park, about the noun. So it's like a commentary, an extra commentary about the noun. And it is not necessary to define or identify Hyde Park because there is only one Hyde Park in London. Okay, so this is why this is the big difference with defining relative clauses. Okay, so we are not identifying Hyde Park because there's only one of them. We are simply giving more information about the park. And as always, we link the relative clause to the noun with a relative pronoun. So in this example, the relative pronoun is which, the word which. And this links the relative clause here to the noun here. Okay? Now, a very important punctuation rule for non-defining relative clauses. So, we use commas when writing non-defining relative clauses. This is very important. Example. So, we visited Hyde Park, which is close to Buckingham Palace. And this is the comma. So it is a little line at the bottom of the line after the word. So the comma separates the non-defining relative clause from the rest of the sentence. Okay, so it's like a separator. And here the non-defining relative clause is at the end of the sentence, and there is one comma in the middle. And this example, the relative clause is in the middle of the sentence, and so we need two commas to separate it from the sentence. We have a comma here and a comma here. Hyde Park, which is close to Buckingham Palace, is closed today. So this is the non-defining relative clause, comma here and a comma here, and everything outside the commas, that is just the main sentence. Hyde Park is closed today. And the extra information is that it is close to Buckingham Palace. And that is obviously the comma here and here. And remember that commas, they actually represent a pause. So when we actually say this sentence, we pause when there is a comma, and the intonation changes slightly. So if you listen, Hyde Park, which is close to Buckingham Palace, is closed today. Okay? Very important. We always use commas with non-defining relative clauses. Relative pronouns. Let's look at some examples. Who. We use it for people, and it can be a subject or an object pronoun. Example. Mr. Smith, who works with me, has invited me to a party. And here, the word who is the relative pronoun, and it is acting as a subject pronoun. who works with me. And this is the relative clause, the non-defining relative clause, with a comma here and a comma here. Mr. Smith, who I like, has invited me to a party. And here, who is acting as an object pronoun, who I like. Whom. Again, this is for people, and it is only an object pronoun. Mr. Smith, whom I like, has invited me to a party. So this can only be an object pronoun. So whom I like. This is the relative clause. But remember that whom is only really used in very formal English. It is not very common in modern English. And it is in fact more common to use who as the object pronoun for people. Like this example. It is more common to do it like this. And important, who and whom are never replaced by that. Okay, so that's important. And we'll discuss that in a few minutes. Which. This is for things or animals. And it can be a subject or an object pronoun. Example, he gave me a cake which was on a white plate. Which was on a white plate. So this is the non-defining relative clause here. And we have the comma here. And we have the word which is acting as a subject pronoun. Because it's giving us more information about the subject. Okay? He gave me a cake which I ate immediately. And this time we have the same word which, but this time it is acting as an object, which I ate. So in fact, I ate a cake, which is representing the word cake. So I ate the cake is it's an object. And again, which is never replaced by that. Okay? So, let's now discuss that. For non-defining relative clauses, we never use that. Okay? We never use that in non-defining relative clauses. Examples. So, this is correct for a person. We use who. Mr. Smith, who works with me, has invited me to a party. So that is fine. But we do not replace it with that in non-defining relative clauses. So this is wrong. Another example. Mr. Smith, whom I like, has invited me to a party. So this is correct in formal English, as we have already seen. But this is wrong. We do not replace whom with that. Okay, we cannot use that. So this is wrong. He gave me the cake, which I ate immediately. He gave me the cake. That I ate immediately. So this is correct. That is fine because we are using the word which. But this is wrong because we never use that in non-defining relative clauses. And we only use that in defining relative clauses. And I explain defining relative clauses in a different video. Whose. This is for people or things. And it is a possessive. It describes possession of something. Mark, whose brother works with me, wants to buy my house. So this is the non-defining relative clause. And this is the relative pronoun, whose. So what does this mean? Well, the whole sentence means, well, there are two things. First of all, Mark wants to buy my house. Okay, so it is Mark who wants to buy my house. And Mark's brother works with me. Okay, so it is the brother of Mark works with me. Okay, so that's the meaning. So it is quite a useful structure because we can say two things in one sentence. So one whole sentence using the non-defining relative clause and the main clause, we can say two different things. So it's quite a powerful structure. The relative pronoun of a non-defining clause can never be omitted. Okay, so it means that the relative pronoun of a non-defining clause, it's compulsory. We must write it. We must use it. Example. I gave him a bottle of water, which he drank very quickly. So this is fine. This is correct because we have the relative pronoun here. We are using it. But this is wrong because here we have omitted the relative pronoun. We are not using it, and that is wrong. We cannot say this. So this is an important rule. The relative pronoun is only omitted from a defining relative clause, and only when it is the object of the clause. Example of a defining relative clause. She is drinking the coffee that you made. That is correct. And here we have omitted the relative pronoun that. She is drinking the coffee you made. And that is correct when we are using a defining relative clause. And again, this is in a separate video, and I'll give you the link to the video in a couple of minutes. There is a very special use of which. Remember, normally we use which to give more information about a specific thing, about a noun. Example. He gave me a cake which was on a white plate. Okay, we have already seen this. So here, the relative pronoun which is referring to one word. It is referring to the noun cake, just one word, cake. But the special use is we can also use which to give more information about a clause. For example, he forgot to give me the cake, which was very annoying. Okay, so we have a first part of the sentence, or a clause, he forgot to give me the cake, which was very annoying. So here, this is the non-defining relative clause, but the word which, the relative pronoun which, is referring to all of the clause. It's referring to the situation. So the cake is not annoying. It is the fact that he forgot to give me the cake. The situation was very annoying. The whole clause, all of this was very annoying. Okay, so this is a very special case where which refers to a clause, not just a noun. And a second example, Mark passed his driving test, which is fantastic. Okay, again, which is referring to the whole clause. The test isn't fantastic. It is the whole situation, the fact that Mark passed his driving test. This situation, this clause, the meaning of this is fantastic. Okay? And don't forget the commas. So again, we always have a comma to separate the non-defining relative clause from the rest of the sentence. And here is the comma here. So very important, don't forget the commas.
Think of a clause as a sentence with one verb. In order to avoid repetition of words, we use a relative pronoun to substitute for what you need to say twice. In this case, the relative pronoun that works as a subject. In this case, the relative pronoun which works as an object. Relative clauses are used to join two sentences or to give more information about something or someone. When it comes to writing, they play a very important role as cohesive devices. However, note that what is not a relative pronoun. Whenever you feel tempted to use what to put two sentences together, try and remember the correct pronoun will be which. By the way, make sure to spell which correctly. Skipping an H is a very common spelling mistake that causes a terrible impression on the reader. And make sure not to change the meaning of what you want to say. Subject-relative clauses are used when the relative pronoun replaces the subject of the main clause or refers to the subject. The relative pronouns you can use are who, which, that, and whose. You cannot omit the pronoun. Object-relative clauses are used when the relative pronoun replaces the object of the main clause or refers to the object. The relative pronouns you can use are who or whom, which, that, or whose. You can omit the pronoun when using object-relative clauses. Even though the name may sound weird, defining relative clauses are a vital part of the meaning of a sentence. They define who or what you are talking about. This is the reason why you cannot use commas with defining relative clauses. Keep in mind that the pronoun can only be omitted if it refers to the object. Note that other relative pronouns are also possible. To explain reason, we use why. To mention time, we use when. To describe place, we use where. On the other hand, non-defining relative clauses add extra information that is not essential to the meaning of the sentence. In other words, it could be left out. This is the reason why you must use commas with non-defining relative clauses. Keep in mind that the relative pronoun cannot be omitted. Actually, one of the most important implications in your writing is that the relative pronoun that cannot be used in non-defining relative clauses. So, whenever in doubt, go for which and who instead of that, as they will always be correct in both defining and non-defining relative clauses. Sometimes, when using object relative clauses, there will be a word that calls for a dependent preposition. You can either place the preposition at the very end of the sentence, which is the colloquial alternative, or you can place it in front of the relative pronoun. This alternative is more formal and therefore more appropriate when you're writing. Note that in this case, the pronoun cannot be removed. You may also need to identify a certain number of people or things from a group in an object relative clause. In order to do this, you will use quantifiers. In this case, the relative pronoun cannot be omitted. Note that the use of the form whom is compulsory after a preposition, so don't use who whenever it is placed after a preposition. Okay?